Valley of the Kings was dead silent in November of 1922. After years of searching, the desert dust seemed to cover nothing but an empty horizon. But 50 feet down, the expedition leader held a chisel against a limestone door. The plaster bore an unmistakable emblem, the jackal standing over 9 bound captives. It was a sacred warning of protection, enforced for over 3 millennia. Breaking that boundary meant violating the last intact time capsule of the ancient world. Ignoring the warning, the Egyptologist drove an iron bar into the crack in the rock. As he forced it open, a rush of hot, dense air escaped into the dark, carrying the weight of a line that should never have been crossed. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb is typically celebrated in history books as the greatest, most brilliant triumph of modern archaeology, a polished tale of persistence and glory under the unforgiving Egyptian sun. But the documented reality of those days, November of 1922, falls far short of the glamour that Western culture has immortalized. The true chronicle of that event isn't about the allure of gold or the triumph of modern science. At its core, it is about a deep, quiet obsession. It is the story of a crew on the brink of physical exhaustion and total financial collapse, led by a man willing to cross the point of no return between rigorous research and the invasion of a sacred space never meant to be found. This is the historical autopsy of the expedition's heaviest, most defining hours. We will dismantle the romanticized version and examine the exact moment when the modern instinct to dissect the past collided head-on with the ethical boundary of preserving a final rest. And if you value history told with this kind of documentary weight and sobriety, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us what city or country you are watching from. We make it a point to know who is on the other side of the screen, and we love reading and replying to everyone in our community. To grasp the true gravity of what unfolded on those suffocating stairs, you have to look far beyond the solid gold death masks. When the crew of Egyptian and British excavators cleared the final layer of rubble, 50 feet below the bedrock, they didn't find a peaceful, untouched gateway to eternity. What waited for them in the gloom was a deeply disturbing anomaly. Howard Carter, breathing heavily in the oxygen-starved air and the dim lantern light, brushed the plaster surface of the door. He was met with a detail that completely changed the nature of the dig. The physical evidence was carved right at the entrance. Yes, the official seal of the necropolis was there, proving the presence of royalty. But mixed into the original plaster, Carter spotted undeniable marks that the rock had already been fractured and patched back together in antiquity. That realization was a quiet blow to everyone present. Someone, thousands of years before this modern expedition arrived, had already walked down those same shadow-drenched steps. The structure had been breached, the sanctuary invaded, and then hastily resealed by the valley's ancient guards. Carter understood, in a fraction of a second, that he wasn't stepping into a pure environment of worship and silence. He was looking at a millennial crime scene, frozen in time. Uncertainty crushed their initial optimism. Were they about to access the greatest untouched archive of human civilization? Or were they just breaking into a hollow chamber, emptied by looters before the great Egyptian empire even fell? Reason called for caution and methodical documentation of every trace, but the imminent end of their funding demanded absolute haste. The line was drawn, and the past would be forced to answer. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a deadline running out? That suffocating feeling that the sand in the hourglass is almost gone, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. In the fall of 1922, that was the exact mood in the British camp, set up under the merciless sun of Egypt. The Egyptologist in charge of the expedition was, quite literally, at rock bottom. For almost half a decade, he had turned over tons of scorching gravel. He had mapped entire quadrants with military precision, burning through an incalculable fortune. And the result of all this monumental effort was absolute, frustrating emptiness. The vast landscape of the Valley of the Kings, with its arid canyons and jagged cliffs, no longer inspired mystery. It just looked like a massive, exhausted graveyard. The greatest experts of the era had already signed definitive reports, declaring that not a single fragment of history was left to be found there. All the great sovereigns had already been located, cataloged, or plundered centuries ago by human greed. The silence of that sea of sand seemed to mock the unshakable persistence of this small, isolated crew. To make matters even more critical, the expedition's main financial backer had reached his logical and financial limit. This was an aristocrat who bankrolled everything, from the heavy iron tools to the very last canteen of water. In a tense, uncompromising meeting back in England, the ultimatum was delivered. This would irrevocably be the final digging season, the last shipment of funds. If nothing concrete was discovered in the coming weeks, the heavy canvas tents would be taken down, the open trenches would be filled, and the search would be shut down forever. A melancholy end to a career spent entirely in the dust. The colossal weight of that responsibility instantly changed the rhythm inside the camp. Urgency took hold of the diggers' calloused hands. There was no more room for miscalculations, no more time to explore low-probability areas. The excavation leader then made a decision that, to many of his peers, sounded like the final irrational act of a desperate man. He ordered his crew of workers to turn their undivided attention to a sector that every other archaeologist had solemnly ignored for decades. It was an uninteresting area, covered by the rustic foundations of old stone huts, makeshift shelters, built by the tomb builders themselves millennia prior. The classic academic logic was airtight, always beating the same drum. No one in their right mind would build workers' housing directly over the entrance of a sacred royal tomb. But the razor-sharp intuition of a man backed into a corner made him ignore the textbooks. The heavy pickaxes began to swing with redoubled force, smashing into the ruins of those ancient dwellings. The heat at the bottom of the canyon was punishing. The white limestone dust invaded their eyes and lungs with every heavy breath. The physical exhaustion of the crew bordered on unbearable. Even so, against all odds, under strict orders, they pushed on, moving stone by stone, basket by basket, sweeping the parched floor of the valley until they hit the hard, impenetrable bedrock. It was mechanical, rhythmic work, guided only by a spark of blind hope. It was on the morning of November 4th that the thick atmosphere of the camp felt an electric shift. Arriving at the digging front, the expedition leader noticed an unusual silence from afar. The pickaxes had stopped swinging. The constant scraping of dragged stones had completely ceased. At the bottom of a freshly opened trench, squeezed under the remains of the first demolished hut, a worker was carefully brushing away the dust with his bare hands, barely blinking. There, carved directly into the solid, untouched stone of the valley floor, was the straight, unmistakable outline of a step. This wasn't a natural formation sculpted by the wind. These were precise architectural lines molded by human hands thousands of years ago. Adrenaline wiped away the crew's accumulated fatigue in a fraction of a second. The order that followed was sharp and immediate. Dig with maximum force, but with the surgical precision of a watchmaker. Throughout that long day and deep into the following dawn, the first step revealed a second, then a third. A steep, narrow, and frighteningly well-preserved staircase began to materialize, descending dizzily into the deep darkness of the underground. With every heavy layer of rubble hoisted to the surface, the anticipation on site grew almost suffocating. They were, quite literally, descending into the locked domains of the ancient world, and at 50 feet deep, right at the limit of the breathable air, the iron tools finally hit an impassable vertical obstacle. It was no longer packed dirt or loose gravel. It was a massive stone wall coated top to bottom in a thick layer of gray plaster. The crew stopped. Everyone was panting in the hot, thin air of that cramped pit. The trembling light of the oil lanterns revealed what the entire scientific community of the time thought was a pipe dream. The door was there, solid, imposing, and silent. The original plaster covered the entire structure of the entrance, blocking any physical or visual access to whatever lay on the other side. In that incredibly narrow moment, at the bottom of a hole covered in dirt and sweat, hope surged back with untamed force. The funding was just days away from being cut off for good. The international reputation of that man was hanging by an invisible thread. But that imposing limestone wall represented an absolute archaeological miracle. There it was, the physical promise of something that had escaped the cunning of night looters, the erosion of time, and the arrogance of modern man. Now, they only needed one thing. They needed to break through that ancient barrier. They needed to find out if the painful sacrifice of a lifetime would be rewarded with a hollow, forgotten room or with a direct passport to the center of history. Dust, untouched for over 3 millennia, coated the surface of the limestone rock, hiding the details of a barrier that separated the modern world from an absolute past. In that narrow shaft, 50 feet down, the air was thick, hot, and nearly unbreathable. Howard Carter approached the structure with the caution of a surgeon. The flickering lantern light cast dancing shadows on the walls of the newly excavated staircase, while he used a delicate brush to sweep away the first layer of crusted sand at the top of the door. What emerged from beneath the bristles was physical proof that his crew's blind intuition had been absolutely right. Stamped into the original plaster, intact and solemn, was the seal of the royal necropolis, the crisp image of the jackal resting over 9 bound prisoners. It was the unquestionable signature of the guardians of the Valley of the Kings, a clear sign that someone of noble blood rested there. But the true euphoria was incredibly short-lived. As Carter kept brushing, moving the light down toward the base of the entrance, relief gave way to a quiet, deeply unsettling tension. There was a physical anomaly in the texture of the door, a deep scar in the rock that told a completely different story than the one they were hoping to find. A large chunk of the original plaster had been broken off and replaced with a darker, uneven mortar. This wasn't natural wear and tear from time, nor ancient water damage. It was the record of an aggressive human intervention. And worse, slapped over this rough patch was a second set of seals, completely different from the first. The forensic conclusion was immediate and ruthless. Someone, a very long time ago, had walked down those same shadow-drenched stairs, smashed the original barrier, and breached the sanctuary. The door hadn't been perfectly sealed since the day of the king's burial. It had been forced open and later hastily closed up by the ancient authorities. The silence among the excavation crew became suffocating. Finding that mark triggered a drastic shift in the expedition's psychology. The dream of unearthing an immaculate time capsule began to crumble, swiftly replaced by the ghost of loss. Ancient Egyptian tomb robbers were known for their ruthless efficiency. They knew the architectural blueprints, they mapped out escape routes, and they rarely left anything behind but scraps. Were they about to open the door to the greatest historical treasure trove in human civilization? Or were they burning the last financial reserves of their lives just to access a hollow chamber, emptied out and forgotten thousands of years before they were even born? That doubt morphed into mental torture. Every passing minute seemed to stretch the crew's anxiety. There they stood, on the physical razor's edge between total failure and absolute consecration, separated by just a few inches of limestone and patched plaster. The whitish dust coated the exhausted faces of the local workers who stood motionless, watching the tense features of their leader. Nobody dared to celebrate. The physical presence of that double seal was a cruel reminder that archaeology has a habit of punishing naive optimism. Still, there was no room to back down. The bureaucratic machine demanded definitive answers, and the funds were pushed to the absolute limit. A telegram had already been sent to England summoning the expedition's sponsor across the long submarine cables. Lord Carnarvon was on his way, crossing the sea, expecting to witness an intact miracle. By the time he arrived, that door would have to come down. Until then, the crew was forced to live with the phantom presence of those ancient intruders, knowing that the first footsteps on those stairs belonged to men who, long ago, had likely stolen the king's eternity. And it is exactly on this narrow bridge, suspended between the exhaustion of an expiring deadline and the edge of an unknown abyss, that the true impact of this story takes hold. The moment of revelation wouldn't be guided by academic patience, but by the physical, irreversible blow that would tear the boundary between worlds wide open. The day the world changed was the 26th of November, 1922. It dawned with an unusual heaviness in the Valley of the Kings. It wasn't just the unforgiving desert heat pressing down. It was the physical weight of an expectation that had crossed continents. The expedition's backer was standing at the bottom of that limestone pit, accompanied by his closest, most trusted crew. The silence between them was absolute. The sealed plaster door, bearing its dark scars of a millennial break-in, dominated their vision and demanded an almost aggressive reverence. There was no more room for exhausting debates or delays. It was time for raw, physical, irreversible action, the point of no return that would alter modern understanding of the ancient world once and for all. The expedition leader stepped up to the ancient barrier. In his hand, he held no delicate researcher's brush, but a heavy iron bar. Every movement was watched with bated breath by those huddled on the cramped staircase. The air, 50 feet underground, was already stifling, but anxiety was chewing up whatever oxygen remained in that claustrophobic space. He sized up the aged surface, picked a spot in the upper left corner of the door where the material looked slightly less dense, and struck the first solid blow. The dry, hollow crack of metal crushing plaster echoed off the pit walls like muffled thunder. It was the physical tearing sound of time being violated. With methodical, muscular effort, the excavation director forced the tool against the stone, twisting the metal until a sizable chunk of the mortar gave way and crashed to the dusty floor. A small, dark crack, about the size of a clenched fist, opened up on the once impenetrable surface. In that exact fraction of a second, something tactile and deeply frightening happened. A breath of hot, dense air, carrying the unmistakable scent of centuries of absolute isolation, rushed violently through the gap. That air had been locked inside for over 3,300 years. It had brushed against the solemn faces of Egyptian priests, and now, like an invisible ghost, it met the sweating face of a 20th century man. The sacred boundary, at long last, had been physically broken. The silence on the stairs grew even more deafening. Nobody moved or dared to whisper. Following the strict safety protocols for deep excavations meant to prevent the deadly buildup of toxic gases, the team leader struck a match and lit a candle. With a surprisingly steady hand, though his face was tight with tension, he brought the fragile flame close to the dark crack. The light flickered aggressively. The steady flow of ancient air escaping the unknown interior made the flame shake almost violently, casting long, desperate shadows across the exhausted faces around him. The gigantic temporal void was being filled by the present, and the atmospheres of two completely different eras crashed together with brute force in that small, oppressive underground space. When the little flame finally stabilized, signaling that the air rising from the depths was breathable, the Egyptologist pressed his grimy face against the cold stone and brought his right eye up to the small opening. The first few seconds were dominated by thick, absolute darkness. The human eye had to fight fiercely against the lack of light just to start picking out shapes in the pitch black. But gradually, as the trembling candlelight pierced the sleeping gloom, the heavy fog of the millennia began to lift. Details started to emerge from the total void. Strange shapes, imposing outlines of guardian animals, hand-carved textures, and creeping out of the shadows, the unmistakable, warm, hypnotic gleam of solid gold, catching the light for the first time in countless generations. Behind him, the shared tension was unbearable. The British financier, the man who had sacrificed a massive chunk of his fortune for this final opportunity, squeezed his trembling hands while staring at the motionless back of the expedition leader. Time at the bottom of the pit felt completely frozen in a frame of pure, paralyzing anxiety. The Egyptologist stayed there, drowned in a tomb-like silence, glued to the door. Every extra second of silence was an elaborate psychological torture. The aristocrat's mind was racing, ruthless. Would this just be another empty, worthless tomb? The crushing weight of years of back-to-back failures threatened to collapse onto their shoulders right then and there, burying any last shred of hope. Unable to stand the torture of the unknown, the backer took a hesitant step forward. With a voice choked and dried out by the ancient dust and extreme nerves, he asked the direct question that would be burned into the official historical records forever, shattering the thick atmosphere of the underground shaft. "Can you see anything?" The excavation leader took what felt like an eternity to process the world around him and reply. He had to draw a breath and slowly pull away from the limestone door, digesting the brutal impact of what he had just witnessed. He didn't shout with wild joy. The weight of the discovery was simply too titanic to allow for a knee-jerk human reaction. With a restrained voice, in a deep whisper, heavy with respect, he delivered the answer that ended centuries of mystery. Yes, wonderful things. Those few short words sealed the fate of everyone on the stairs. The seal was definitively broken, both in the physical sense and in the deepest symbolic sense. The sacred protection had failed against the persistence of modern man. In the intense minutes that followed, the exploratory hole was smashed wider with sledgehammers, carving out an opening big enough for a human to slip through, allowing blinding electric light to flood the darkness. The undeniable climax of archaeological obsession had been fully achieved, but what they were still completely blind to as the plaster dust settled in the corridor was that the breathtaking sight of those riches was just a massive smokescreen. What waited in the deepest gloom wasn't the silence of an untouchable king, but the chaotic, scattered wreckage of an ancestral crime that would warp their entire perception of the dig forever. When the gap in the plaster door was finally widened enough to let a grown man's shoulders pass, the anticipation choking the crew hit its absolute ceiling. Howard Carter, holding an electric flashlight freshly hauled down from the surface, was the first to cross the dark border. The artificial light, pale and raw, sliced through the thick shadows that had rested there for over 3 millennia. The image that history books usually paint of this moment is one of instant glory, a spotless sanctuary where a pharaoh rested surrounded by untouched riches in perfect divine order. But the reality that slammed into the eyes of those exhausted men was brutally different. What they found wasn't a preserved, respectful ceremonial tomb. It was the chaotic scene of an abruptly interrupted crime. The visual shock was an almost painful shattering of expectations. The chamber revealed by the flickering beam of the flashlight, which would later be named the antechamber, was an absurd pile of objects stacked without a shred of reverence. The entire room reeked of haste, desperation, and disorder. Wooden beds coated in solid gold, painstakingly carved into the shapes of sacred animals, were tossed carelessly on top of one another. Heavy pieces of royal chariots meant to carry the monarch on his journey through the afterlife were dismantled and carelessly dumped in the darkest corners. Exquisitely painted boxes, which once held the king's most intimate belongings, lay wide open, with their lids tossed onto the stone floor and their insides violently ransacked. A fine layer of white dust, settled by time, coated the ground, across which the flashlight beam revealed something deeply unsettling. The physical trail of ancient human footprints stamped right into the dry dust. The air of historical triumph and solemnity was instantly wiped out by an instinctive forensic investigation. The expedition leader, his eyes trained by decades of reading the scars of the past, didn't take long to piece together the violent story of that cramped space. The tomb had been ransacked, not by modern adventurers, but by raiders from ancient Egypt itself. Judging by the sheer aggression of the mess, the thieves had broken in with extreme urgency, working under the heavy pressure of fear. They were after the most accessible gold, the precious oils that were worth a fortune back then, and scraps of metal that were simple to hide and carry. They tore through official seals, emptied sacred baskets, and trampled over cult objects in a frantic dash for immediate wealth. However, a crucial investigative detail caught the team's eye as they carefully picked their way through the overturned furniture. If the looters had had enough time to pull off their original plan, the room would have been picked clean of anything valuable. But the heaviest pieces and the most imposing treasures had been left behind. Many just dropped halfway to the exit. There were delicate alabaster vases tipped over near the doorway and bundles of fine linen hastily abandoned on the floor. The conclusion was undeniable, bringing an almost ghostly weight to the silent, stuffy room. The heist had never been finished. The criminals were either caught red-handed during their night raid or spooked by a guard patrol that forced them to drop everything and run for their lives toward the surface. Right after this sudden escape, the ancient necropolis officials arrived to do damage control and figure out how bad the break-in was. But instead of straightening up the sacred chaos and restoring the respect due to the sovereign's rest, they acted with shocking negligence. They just shoved the pieces back into the chamber haphazardly, scooped up the dropped items on the stairs, and tossed them onto the messy pile. Then they sealed the door back up with fresh mortar, trying to scrub away the evidence of the breach with the double seal the crew had spotted at the entrance days before. That dark room wasn't a monument of final rest and peace. It was a frozen testament to corruption, negligence, and a rushed cover-up. The small British crew moved slowly through that maze of gold and dried-out wood, feeling the physical weight of that ancient trespass. They weren't alone on the timeline of that invasion. They were, in fact, the second set of intruders to set foot on that sealed floor. The sense of awe gave way to a cold anguish that quietly settled over the men. If the first room, packed with such priceless artifacts, had been treated like trash by the ancient thieves, what on earth had happened to the deepest, most important part of the tomb? The chaos scattered across the antechamber forced them to face a terrifying thought. This extreme mess might just be a dark warning that the worst was yet to come, and that maybe there was absolutely nothing left of the Pharaoh but a desecrated hole in the ground. This suffocating realization turned the greatest archaeological discovery of the modern era into a tense investigation, where the very next physical step would dictate if the lifelong sacrifice of the whole expedition had been a total waste. Dust still hung in the air of the ransacked chamber, but the expedition leader knew this mess was just a clever distraction meant to wear down the ancient looters. On the far side of the room, the flashlight beam caught a solemn sight. Rising from the deep shadows were two life-sized guardian statues, strictly carved in black wood and gold. Between these relentless sentinels rested a second stone door. Unlike the first entrance, which had been torn up by invaders, this one featured smooth, completely untouched plaster. There, stamped cleanly onto the surface, were the unbroken royal seals. The heart of the empire remained unviolated. The crew instantly grasped the gravity of the moment. The ruler had been sleeping on the other side for over 3 millennia. Breaking through this barrier would require a heavy ethical choice, destroying the definitive rest of a monarch. But the modern hunger for knowledge wasn't going to back down. The final sanctuary would inevitably fall into the hands of the future. Breaking the final seal marked the start of a methodical, invasive dismantling. To reach Tutankhamun, the crew had to pull apart, piece by piece, the heavy golden shrines shielding the sarcophagus. There was no more room for reverence, only the clinical coldness of modern archaeology. For months, the thick air of the tomb echoed with the non-stop scraping of tools, taking apart the sacred. When the mummy finally met the electric light, the world celebrated. The press, however, demanded drama. To explain the natural death of the financier, the newspapers spun up a wild fairy tale of a curse. But the true cost of that dig had nothing to do with ancient spells. The real toll was strictly ethical. Carter's obsession didn't unleash a vengeful spirit, but abruptly ended a monarch's peace. Science gained priceless knowledge, but at an irreversible price. The broken seal of Tutankhamun was never just a physical roadblock of plaster and limestone. It represented a silent, definitive pact that ancient Egypt had made with time. Howard Carter wasn't ignoring supernatural curses or hexes when he raised that iron bar into the dark in 1922. He crossed the strict ethical border that separates respect for a final rest from humanity's unquenchable hunger for the past. By smashing through that millennial barrier, the British expedition shined a light on the greatest secrets of the ancient world, but it also proved that no monarch, no matter how heavily guarded or deeply buried underground, can hide from mankind's destiny and the relentless curiosity of the future. The chamber was emptied. The solid gold was cataloged in glass cases, and Tutankhamun ended his cycle of eternity to become history. If you value documentaries that treat real facts with respect and sobriety, hit subscribe and keep walking this journey with us.